All right, it looks like we've got an awesome crowd here today. Welcome, welcome. My name is Patrika Elise, and I'm here with AI4 as your MC for today's event. We're so excited to have you here today. Just one quick housekeeping item before we get started. Make sure that you're putting your questions in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat feature. This makes it easier for us to answer your questions. All right, it's my pleasure to welcome the Algorithmia team to the virtual stage. Patchen, take it away.
Good morning and thank you. Today we're going to talk about the Algorithmia 2021 Enterprise Trend Report. This is a report that we do every year, and this year's version is just launched today. You can find it on our website for download. And let me introduce here on the next slide to talk about the report today, Diego Oppenheimer, who's the CEO of Algorithmia. Diego's been a part of this report for 3 years running and cares a lot about the AI and ML community and our mission to really free AI and ML from the challenges of getting to production. Welcome, Diego. Do you want to talk to us today about the State of ML report?
Great. Thanks, everybody, for having me today. Super excited to be chatting about this and about the report. And yeah, so it should be a good one. As mentioned, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box. We'll hopefully get those towards the end, and I would love to hear your general thoughts. So as Patchen mentioned, this is our third year running the report. This is a blind study, meaning that we actually send out a survey. They don't know what company's asking for it. We get participation from practitioners across the globe. So this is a random sampling of about over 400 respondents. Usually, what we see is business leaders that are actually involved in machine learning and initiatives at their organization. We look at, for the most part, organizations that have $100 million or more in revenue. Again, this is an enterprise report, and that's where the focus of this particular report is. And it's actually run by a completely independent third party. So if we want to look at the breakdown, more or less, of who's responded, we have about 12% of the C-level, 23% are managers in kind of IT or ML, 6% actual practitioners. So this would be data scientists, machine learning engineers. About 14% are VP title, 40% directors. So nice mix of kind of what we would call leaders and practitioners in the ML space inside some of the largest organizations on earth. That kind of give us a really good insight on how ML is being applied inside the enterprise. What are the challenges, and what are the successes that are coming out of that? So really a couple of themes really popped up in the report this year. And it was really, really clear, and we'll go through some of the data that actually do that. So the first one is, priority shifts. So probably not a surprise to anybody, but, as the pandemic has hit and has, kind of organizations have looked inside and reevaluated their priorities, one of the things that we've actually seen is a really dramatic investment in AI and ML in this time of economic uncertainty. And we'll dig a little bit deeper into that, but this is really interesting because what it means is essentially saying when AI and ML has been applied to things like cost savings or like revenue generation or customer success, the results have been there. And because of that, important, especially to move to digital, doubling down on those efforts is something that actually came out of the reporting that we're seeing. We're still seeing a number of challenges. So we're trying to see that enterprises are really continuing to face some of the basic challenges of approaching an ML lifecycle and how to actually be able to deploy, run, and integrate machine learning into their business use cases. We're seeing what we call a technical debt is piling up. New technologies, new methodologies, new people. This is all actually building out. And so even though there's a massive increase in investment, organizations are actually spending a lot more time and resources being able to deal with this investment around that. And then one of the things that we started seeing is this world of machine learning ops or machine learning operations preferences. And one of the things that came out of the report is that there is starting to move a tendency from initially we built something ourselves and we got up and running to we're looking to help from third parties, vendors, and platforms that exist to kind of enable this pathway and double down because it's a cheaper way of doing it and a faster way of doing it. And so we'll see some of the data that represents that as well. So we grouped inside these themes. So inside the 4 themes, we grouped about kind of 10 trends that we've that popped out in the report. The main one being, that the budgets are increasing, kind of what we already mentioned there. We see that customer experience and automation are the use cases that have bubbled up the quickest into what organizations are doubling down on and approaching from an ML perspective. There's an increasing gap between the AI ML haves and have-nots, meaning certain organizations are really getting high-tuned in how to deploy ML inside their organization, how to double down on it. They're seeing the ROI and they're moving very quickly. And that is actually kind of leaving behind the laggards around that. There's a number of challenges that still show up, and there's about 4 trends that come into that. One being governance. How do we actually govern over this entire new process and life cycle? Remains being the top challenge. We still see a lot of basic integration and compatibility issues. How do I get all these technologies talking to each other? How do I integrate them into my stack? How do I make the world of my IT organization be able to adopt this new technology and bring it to market? Probably not surprising to many people, but still we need organizational alignment. And approaching ML inside an organization is a multidisciplinary effort, and bringing in people from the IT organization, the business organization, the data science and ML community. This tends to be one of the biggest problems that large organizations are facing, which is how do we bring this all together, get on the same page? And then around that. So let me just, and then if we start looking at the technical debt piling up, we're seeing something that was actually pretty surprising to us. We expected, as all this investment coming in, we expected deployment times were going to be going down. They've been going up. So the complexity, the attention, the fact that these new use cases are actually being built into more critical components of an organization has actually slowed down the process of getting deployed and up into production because of all the things that need to be tied to it. So this is a really interesting trend that obviously we're doing a lot more in terms of ML, but actually it's taking us longer to do it because, likely these are more critical components that have, again, more organizational alignment that need to happen. Data scientists are still spending way too much time on deployment, and that is problematic. And then again, from MLOps preferences, and we'll talk about it, that we're seeing a number of organizations reporting that they've actually improved their outcomes by quite a bit because of the MLOps solutions that they're adopting. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this, and let's look at the data. So again, year 20, the enterprise 21, what's the year of ML, right? We talk about this was a year of increased urgency for ML. So not only they get the initial efforts, up and running, but also this is actually producing some technical debt down the line. So what we want to see is that, organizations in 2021 are likely going to be investing quite heavily in operationalizing their machine learning so that they can actually, get the greatest rewards out of this, technology. So let's talk a little bit about the priority shifts and what the data told us there. So we see about 83% of organizations have increased their AI and ML budgets year on year. And so this is we kind of broke it up into what, did you increase it by 1 to 25%, 26 to 50%, 51 to 75%, no change, and, if there's a decrease. And so you can see a pretty stark increase across the board in terms of how we're going to be moving from the budget year 2018 to 2019 to 2019 and 20, how they've increased their budgets in almost every single category and are continuously investing into the machine learning efforts in an organization. So when we look at the kind of 83% of the total population in this new report compared to last year are actually increasing their budget, with only 4% of the survey that are actually decreasing their budget, and a smaller, even 13% that are doing no change. So a clear investment pattern, and this is anybody who's listened to any sort of public earnings call can see that every single major enterprise is looking at their AI ML strategy as a key strategic initiative for the organization moving into the future. So when we actually look at the number of data scientists employed inside a organization, we see a 76% year-over-year increase. And this is actually quite stark. Just imagine the amount of people that are being added to these efforts and the investment in hiring, training, applying, and getting these models and getting these data scientists applied to the business is doing. So massive increase in terms of the number of data scientists being employed across all organizations. The second big trend that we actually saw is that there's really two use cases that have really bubbled up in terms of where we're actually applying these, these resources. Customer experience and automation are taking that priority. But what an even more interesting perspective was on how we actually look at the use cases is that more than 5 use cases were actually, the 70% of people increased to more than 5 use cases, how they're doing. So it's not just that ML is being used for one thing inside the organization, but that there's actually more than, there's 5 or more different use cases inside an organization where AI and ML are being applied to. So this actually shows that proliferation inside an organization of, hey, this is a technology that we can apply to different certain areas that we're investing in, that we're going and hiring people for. And then on top of that, that we're actually seeing that it can actually expand to the rest of the organization in that way. So some of the use cases, and we kind of broke it up into like the 4 major categories that we saw from a color coding, and we have a couple more, but it's like customer experience. So super important, as the world has moved into from a physical to a completely digital world, is, customer experience, making sure that our customers are actually happy and they're doing that has been a major focus of AI use cases. So this is everything from, doing, health topics and, customer care topics, increasing customer loyalty, next best action, generating customer insights. These are all use cases that really bubbled up. So then we go into the kind of like automation and cost reduction. So we're looking at inefficient operations that can be automated inside an organization that allow to reduce costs and increase velocity of those workloads. And this is another massive investment area. And it's interesting because anecdotally, if I tell you about what we've seen in industry, is that these are use cases that are really ripe for machine learning. So they actually have a really high success rate. When we start looking at kind of back office automation tasks, contract reviews using NLP, anti-money laundering, fraud. These are use cases that have a high degree of success inside an organization and that can actually really be scaled out. So it's not a surprise that obviously in a time of uncertainty that there's been a doubling down on some of these use cases around that. But one thing to point out, wide variety of use cases really being applied at every single part of the business, even in major enterprises, which is really interesting around that perspective. So if we look at kind of like the 3 main ones that I think are worth noting, improving customer experience, 57% of respondents were actually talking about that. Generating customer insights, over 50% of respondents were talking about those use cases being inside. And then automating process, again, 50% of the people, responding to the survey were also, saying that these were use cases that were being covered inside their organization. So what we show here is that, in almost every single use case, we see over 50% of organizations, actually increasing their usage of AI ML for them. And this is actually like a big, a big trend that we see. So like the viability, the heterogeneity of the use cases, and the expansion across the organization of where AI and ML can be applied and where the success rates are happening has really expanded year over year. And so this is really encouraging to see, because this means this is a technology that is being widely adopted. It's being used in almost every part of the organization, and it's seeing results. And that's actually a really encouraging trend to start seeing. One of the things that I think was that popped out is if we think about, in a rapidly changing environment. So the pandemic hurt this year. We didn't really know what was going on. there was a lot of uncertainty in the economy. There was a lot of uncertainty in like how organizations were to approach it. And one of the immediate things that actually happened is this vast acceleration into digital experiences over physical experiences that every single business needed to deal with. And again, outside of AI, everything from moving entire populations to remote to like, online sales, everything had that kind of massive shift in towards the digitization. Well, it happens to be that AI ML, this is the core thing where AI ML can help. And so it's actually interesting to see that not only has this been a successful, move towards those digital experiences, but the results that have been showing have allowed organizations to double down on these efforts and accelerate them, getting them into production faster, running these, investing in them. So, this has been to a certain degree a catalyst in a lot of the AI ML adoption inside organizations. So we talk about the third trend being that, there's a haves and have-nots in the AI ML gap. And this is really interesting because if we would have rewinded about 5 years ago, machine learning would have really been the specialty or kind of like reserved for the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons of the world and certain financial services institutions that had been adapting this type of technology for a long time. Well, what we're seeing is that not only most organizations now are well within reach of being able to build out machine learning capabilities, but actually over half of the respondents already say that today inside the organization they have over 25 models in production, and over 40% of those respondents have over 50 models in production. And I think this is a big change that we've seen. Like, this is, again, going to see that value, being able to actually run those models, being actually to say, hey, this is going to be affecting our business metrics and is important, and then we can actually see how that's been evolving. So one thing that really popped out is that world's largest enterprises are actually dominating, the high end of model scale. And so only 7% of organizations with 25,000 or fewer employees have more than 100 models in production. But among the very largest of enterprises, we see over 41% having over 100 models in production. We believe that they've been early adopters in the space, and that's actually giving a first mover advantage. And that this market is actually still today dominated by the early adopters, but the barrier to entry into AI and ML has actually been lowered quite a bit. So it's a really good time to start investing in these capabilities because the barrier to entry has never been lower. So when we start thinking about that barrier to entry and where that is we say, hey, we're looking at the second cusp of adoption, a wave of adoption that is far more accessible to organizations of all sizes and industries. This is because of the tooling that's existed, because the number of startups and enterprises that have actually built out capabilities to go and do it. So it has never been easier for an organization to start with AI and machine learning and start applying it to the business. And that is an actually great place that, I think is really encouraging because we now have true accessibility. People talk about democratization. What we really want to see is organizations really being able to achieve their full potential by applying these technologies to the use cases that can actually move the needle for them. So a lot of the good stuff, but there's a lot of challenges that still remain today inside this. And we'll go break down what are those challenges and how our organization is looking at it. A big part of it is actually managing the full life cycle of machine learning. It is in some organizations, a completely brand new way of thinking. It is cross-functional. It requires alignment. And this is one of the key things that will actually continue separating the haves and the have-nots is how can you actually address these challenges and what can you do about them? So 56% of organizations say that governance is by far their top challenge. And this includes everything from IT governance of the workloads and how they're doing it, security and auditability requirements. I like to kind of call it the who called what, when, with what data, and why. And so this is actually popped up to be the absolute number one challenge that our organizations are facing today when they're actually applying ML to their workloads, their transaction systems, their operational systems. If we go one level down, we can see that the challenges with integration and interoperability, vast amount of frameworks, programming languages, tooling is kind of exploding. And we want to give the ability to the data scientists and machine learning community to use the best tool for the job possible in the same way that you would let a developer use the best tool for the job possible. Well, when you start having that sprawl of technology with that sprawl of frameworks, you now actually create a bit of a challenge, which is how do we standardize deployment, runtime, operations of this organization? How do we monitor and govern all of this happening? How do I, as an organization, take an industrial approach to operationalizing AI and machine learning? And as you can see, the governance perspective, as well as the intercomparabilities, are really top of mind inside the organization and come up as the #1 challenges. If we go into, a little deeper down, things like model performance and being able to quickly monitor, understand what's going on with my models it becomes important. How frequently I can update and maintain model quality and performance. This is about building that entire life cycle. How do I build the first model, deploy it, know that it's running, find out that I need to be updated, go back to retrain it, redeploy it. That entire life cycle needs automation. Right? If it's being done manually, if it's being triggered manually, it is too slow. And so how do we actually industrialize that aspect is becoming super important. And then another thing that's really popping up is that the cost is very, very quickly running up. And so while we can look at it and say, people are pretty familiar with how expensive it is to grab a whole bunch of GPUs and train machine learning models, and we see these numbers, where the inference side, which is the scoring of models, that becomes an actually much more expensive aspect inside an organization and is actually overshadowing the cost of even training. And so as organizations have been adopting more and more machine learning, those inference costs are going up. So having an efficient way of doing that compute, being able to deploy it in an efficient way, being able to control those costs, being able to view those costs, kind of going back up into that governance aspect is becoming a top of thing around that. So when we asked about inside governance, we asked a little bit about regulation. So, and one of the things is like, how many organizations needed to comply with a regulation that was relevant in these ML workloads? And over 67%, had responded that they had at least one regulation that they needed to comply for. And so this goes back to why governance is really showing up and becoming so high mind, because, hey, there's actually regulatory compliance that's coming down with this. And over 67% are in one way or another. Only 8% of respondents said they had no regulations whatsoever that they needed to comply with inside their ML workloads. And this, again, was a big difference that we saw, from a year ago, which is these are really popping up. They're top of mind. That we are seeing how those things are coming down. So when we broke down like 67% of organizations that are, that they need to comply with AIML. So we can see that this chart shows, the percentage of respondents that selected each regulation, that we see the percentage of respondents who selected no regulation. And so, again, the methodology of categorizing, like this is important. What we want to see is how, where are you? What are the things that you care about from these workloads? Do you need to be HIPAA compliant, FISMA, PCI, SOC compliant? And then thinking about, okay, as I need to be in compliance with these regulations, how is the industrialization of my ML workflows? How am I building out this like repeatable way of getting into production and running and applying AI/ML to a business? Make sure that it is compliant with these regulations that might not necessarily be specific to AI, but they are actually to the entire system that I'm delivering on, or the experience that I'm delivering on to my customer base or my stakeholder base. So another big thing that really popped up was the, how much integration and compatibility issues still remain. So this idea that, these technologies are exploding. We see that they're trying to adopt a whole bunch of new technologies. They're trying to be nimble and agile and saying, hey, let's go use AutoML tools where we can. Let's go use, these different data processing tools where we can. As that sprawl of tooling has actually like built out, that compatibility and how to actually bring in all these technologies, keep up to date. I mean, the speed at which these frameworks are being updated and technologies are being updated is crazy fast. And so how they're actually dealing with that fact that is a changing goal, the goalposts continue moving, and being able to adapt that speed and get up into running and build out, again, that industrial aspect of how we're going to move ML into production, how we're going to actually run machine learning in all these use cases that we clearly are investing on. This seems to be one of the biggest challenges in compatibility that still exists today in the organization. So one of the things that that really popped up, and we talk about this around it, which is there's a need for organizational alignment. And I think one of the things that really, we saw a wide array of titles, everything from CIOs to CTOs to who's who's the decision maker in the organization, who's deciding how we're going to go apply ML, what the process, what the methodology is. So this is everybody from chief data officers to the heads of business intelligence and analytics, to senior IT leaders, to heads of data science and machine learning. So what this tells us is that there is a lot of cross-functional people involved, and that each organization is still figuring out how they're actually going to apply ML to the organization, how they're going to do their investments, and how their leadership is going to be aligned on making these decisions moving forward. And so one of the interesting things that we really saw is that if we look at the IT infrastructure and operation leaders, we usually call them an I&O leaders. These are the folks that are tending to take the task of saying, hey, we own the task of industrializing our software stack, of industrializing our security stack. We are going to be taking on the task of industrializing our AI and ML stack and being able to do that and serve the organization. And so this is a trend that we saw from the beginning, which is, hey, now I have these IT infrastructure and operations leaders who are coming, kind of lifting up their hand and saying, look, this is going to be a critical part of our software journey and our digital journey as an organization. And because we own the speed, stability, scale of that IT investment, AI/ML is now part of that, and they're taking on that ownership. So when we look at the maturity around that, we said, hey, we asked organizations to self-identify where they thought there was maturity and where they were from an organizational perspective. And it was really interesting to see that the number one place of medium maturity was around organizational alignment. So a lot of these organizations especially said, hey, we think we're pretty mature from a model development perspective and a deployment and management perspective and a governance and compliance. And my addition to that, I would say, is that we're so early on in this journey that I'm surprised that so many people would say that they were high level of maturity. I joke around that this might be like how everybody thinks they're above an average driver. And so one of the things to look at here is say, okay, there's still a recognition that organizationally, these enterprises are not really understanding or all on the same page of how DevOps, how IT, how data science, how the business work together to achieve AI and machine learning maturity. And so I thought that was a kind of interesting thing that came up, which is, and we think this is step one, right? Organizational alignment and maturity is essentially where we should start. So the fact that this does not have the highest level of maturity, and we start going into kind of like the actual technical implementation has been something that really popped out. And so we see that the data, people say it's still struggling to get that organizational alignment, and that's going to be one of the things that we believe is going to start happening as these roles define themselves in the next year. So I'm very excited to see about the survey next year on how these roles are going to actually align themselves. So the bottom line is that there's kind of 5 factors that we see that really produce an inefficient machine learning lifecycle. And the survey data kind of shows that. There's the stuck in the lab, which is I have data scientists that are not thinking about production, that the governance, they're not thinking about IT security, they're not thinking about how this is going to scale. And because of that is why they're getting stuck in the lab. We see the organizational misalignment from a disconnected teams perspective, which is how do I actually get all these players on the same page so that we can actually achieve the goal of applying ML to a business. The wide explosion of that technology mismatch. Again, one of the challenges that immediately popped up in the survey was we got all these tools. We have so many of these things. New tools are coming out every day. We need to be able to use those new tools that come out every day. How do we figure out how to work compatibility integration? Stakeholder buy-in, again, it's like those authority. Who's owning this? Who's owning it? Is it the business? Is it the chief data officer? Is it the IO leader? And how are they working in that disconnected team problem? And then as the explosion of tools happens, how do we actually maintain that hidden technical debt? And how do we actually start reducing the technical debt of getting into production? So there's some data that actually supports that I'll talk about. But each one of these components are what's driving towards an inefficient machine learning lifecycle. So the technical debt is piling up is something that we talk. So the maintenance cost of these systems, of these one-offs, of these do-it-yourself systems has really been starting to increase inside organizations. And so when we broke this down, the charts are actually really showing how long it's taking respondents to put a trained model into production. We're seeing deployment time increasing over, since last year, and the number is really high. So 64% of respondents, if we grab them all, have taken a month or longer to get a model into production. And so we said, hey, well, let's think about how this compares to last year's data. Why, this was something that kind of came out as strange to us. And we looked at last year's data around the same question. And what we see here is that it's actually getting worse. And, so we can see that how in the gray bars here, the respondents answered, this question last year. The blue bars on the right is how they responded this year. And, again, this is a blind study. I would love to, say that our customer base is actually beating these numbers quite advantageously. We actually have a number of fintech organizations who've reported that, they can deploy a model that's gone from 9 months to 2 hours to get a model in production using our MLOps platform. So this is, again, a blind study. This is of everybody. We're seeing that they've actually taken longer time to deploy into production and get things up and running. So really stark difference. And this starts kind of peeling out the difference between industrializing your ML process versus not. So one thing that continues to be a problem and increase is that data scientists are spending way too much time on deployment. So, we continue as we've hired more people. So this is more time and more cumulative time. If you think about it, 38%, organizations spend more than 50% of their data scientist time on deployment. And so how do we actually get to this? So we ask respondents to indicate how much of their data science time is spent on model deployment. We see that shift to the right, and we see, again, a stark, still problem of we're investing in these people. We want to apply AI and ML to more and more workloads. We're spending an immense amount of time on deployment and infrastructure where we really shouldn't be. And so we actually then kind of wanted to break it down and said, okay, so how does this work if you kind of have more models in production? And it's actually worse. So the more models, again, that organizations have in production, the more time they're spending on deployment. So this means that what we concluded out of this is most organizations are still doing one-offs. They're actually having distributed teams doing everything, doing their own thing. Every team doing kind of the different deployment methodologies. There's no standardization. There's no, quick deployment. So this is actually taking them more and more time to do, even though they're putting massive amount of models into production. So the bottom line is that organizations that are using their increased budgets and headcount to manually scale their AI and ML efforts rather than improve the operational efficiencies. And so this really ties to the challenges. And again, we see this pretty common, which is we talk to these enterprises on a regular basis, and they show us these amazing use cases, but it's very one-off. It's not built for repeatability. There's not an aspect of how we're going to do this in an industrial way across our organization, taking into mind that we're going to start applying ML, we're investing already in the people and applying ML to every single use case in our organization, yet we're not investing yet in actually getting that high scale, high speed, high repeatability of being able to get those models in production, run them, control them, govern them. So the final kind of trend is around MLOps preferences and kind of how we actually look at, what organizations are doing that. And again, what we refer to MLOps is machine learning operations and management. So this is how do we actually think about kind of the DevOps aspect of deploying a model, serving a model, cataloging that model, managing its life cycle into production. So how do the applications connect to it? How do we actually govern all of that? How do we integrate with our IT systems? So we see a clear, so first of all is, the trend is really around improve outcomes with MLOps solutions. So we're going to dive a little bit into the infrastructure of these enterprises and see what was going on there. So we asked them to indicate what infrastructure are they using to deploy their models? And if they selected from a list of providers, some cloud, some on premises. And then based on those responses, what we did is we broke it down into the different types. And this is what these charts show. So hybrid is more than one. And non-hybrid means like they've selected one pattern. So that could be 100% on-prem. It could be 100% in one cloud provider, 100% in another cloud provider. So what you can see here is that there's a clear indication that most enterprises need to deal with more than one infrastructure environment. So that could be a cloud plus on-prem, 2 clouds. So we can see that breakdown on the right here, which is 42% is a combination of some cloud and on-prem. 29% of the enterprises that we're working were in a multi-cloud. 25% were in a single cloud, and then 3% were just thinking about single vendor on premises. And so that's kind of what a clear trend. So this again will go back to problems around compatibility. How do we get the same stuff running in all these environments in the same way? How do we industrialize our deployment and management and lifecycle around it? And so these clearly you can see the trends and the challenges that are going to be matching up here. So again, today, 42% of respondents have indicated that they are hybrid environments consisting of both cloud and on-premise. Last year, it was only 16%. So this is a really big jump in terms of how we see it. So that complexity that gets added to that, but this is where enterprises are today, and we believe this trend is going to continue moving forward. The world in combination of on-prem plus cloud or multi-cloud is really here to stay, and there's a number of reasons that are not just tied to AI and ML, but that for doing this, but what's something we need to consider as we're actually moving models into production, how we're organizing those, that we have to deal with these multiple infrastructure environments. So then, second of all, trend is like we see that, we asked them about cost. So we asked organizations, hey, can you estimate how much you're spending on your annual infrastructure for getting your models in production? And so we put these ranges, 51,000 to 100K, 100K to 300K, and we asked them to provide us a full picture as possible. So, hey, are you buying a third-party solution for this? Are you building it in-house? What your cost infrastructure is to this? We use a really conservative methodology to calculate. And so what we said is we discounted the higher end of the spectrum to do that. And the methodology, by the way, is in the report that you can download later and check out. But what we wanted to understand is, where do you think your cost structure is and how that over time? So there's the build cost, but then there's the maintenance and then the actual infrastructure cost. And so overall, the clear trend from the data was that the people who bought, enterprises who bought third party, who went and bought tooling, bought infrastructure, from third parties, actually spent 19 to 21% less on than the ones that were actually building it from scratch. So if we go back to that first trend around that we were talking about, which is, hey, how does the new world, this new pandemic, in terms of cost optimization and structuring and speed have changed things? We can see here a clear difference of organizations that have gone out with third-party solutions, bought solutions, and are partnering with a number of different tooling out there, have significantly been able to reduce their overall cost as well as their time to market. So if we want to actually go group that out, so we said, we also in the kind of the cost structure is also tied to how much time, right? So, how much time a data scientist, obviously we don't pay by the hour, but, every single moment that a data science team is working on a deployment, they're not working on building new models, they're not working on optimizing their models, they're not actually on moving the needle for the business. And so what we looked at is to say, okay, out of the folks that are buying third-party solutions or using third-party solutions versus actually building it themselves, how does that change, right? And what we can see is that there's a much higher average time spent on model deployment on organizations that have actually built from scratch or actually doing it yourself than the ones that actually have gone third party to kind of solve this and get them fast into that industrial aspect of deploying and running machine learning at scale. And another trend is that we're seeing a 31% decrease in the time that it takes to deploy an actual model and get it into production. So if we look at, the build from scratch, we ask that same question, hey, does it take you a day to a week to a month? 2 to 3 quarters, over a year, and you can see the distribution there. We can see that much, like the distribution goes much more to the left and higher in terms of the buying a third-party solution. And if we average that out, we can see that there's about there's a drop in about 30% in terms of the days on average that it takes for an organization that has adopted a third-party solution than the ones that have actually built it from scratch internally today. So in conclusion, and to kind of start wrapping these things up, and I'll start answering some of the questions, which is 2021 is the year of ML. Next year will be a crucial year for AI and ML initiatives, and there's actually an increased urgency to not, so you don't get left behind. It's actually more accessible than ever. So despite the increasing complexity in the space, it's actually never been easier to start investing in AI ML and scaling that efficiently. Tooling, information, all the things like education for your organization. And one thing that it's really, really clear, to be able to do this in a really efficient way and in a way that will actually get to that industrial aspect so that you can start applying it to those massive use cases that I discussed at the beginning. We really want to start investing in that ML operations and management component early on. So the time to really act is now. And so that's one of the things that it was clear was that like there's a space coming up between the haves and haves not, and how they're applying it and how they're industrializing it. And the data is clear to show that these are the organizations that are going to win, that they're going to have a strategic advantage, and that they're being able to actually expand the use case base of what they're applying their ML initiatives around that. So for those of you who want to download the report, here is the link. And and how we all the data and what we happened for the webinar, you can download the report yourselves and share it around. We're happy to answer any questions, and I really appreciate you listening in today. I'm super excited to talk about this.
Thanks, Diego. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I was gonna say thanks, Diego, for going over that. We have a bunch of questions that came in throughout, and I want to go ahead and just let's answer. So some of them are technical about the data, and some of them I think are going to benefit from your experience, Diego. So let's start with one of those experiential ones. We have a question here about. And could you cite from your experience, Diego, examples how the entry barriers are being lowered for ML adoption and for MLOps?
Yeah, so I think the tooling is just really accessible now, and so there's a like the frameworks have gotten easier to use, data access has gotten better, and so if you think about what do I need, for a use case of an AI ML to be successful, well. I need to figure out a use case that's going to be like successful for the business. So starting from there, I can work backwards and be like, hey, how do I actually get it into production? How am I going to train this? What am I going to use data to use it? The tooling at every single point of the journey has just gotten so much better and so much more accessible. And anybody in any organization, this is just not, it's not just Google that can actually apply ML to their business. And so that access to that tooling is really the thing that's driving this innovation across across the space, which is anybody can go and use these tools and download them and start working with them and building the use cases for it. And so I think accessibility has probably been, and by the way, this goes to data as well. The tooling for managing data, the tooling for for transforming data, for building data warehouses and being able to kind of query into that data has gotten so much better and accessible. And that's the thing that's I've been driving. And the final is the ability of compute. So I talk about kind of like the tooling of how to do it and the frameworks, the data access, and then the ability to compute. It's never been easier to be able to go and spin up, cloud machines and get, the ability of infrastructure at the click of your fingers and all the automation that comes with that. And so as this tooling has removed all the manual processes, it's actually a lot more accessible to be able to think about use case, building the use case, and applying ML to those use cases versus thinking about all the reasons why you can't do it.
That's great. Hey, so we had a technical question here about how maturity was defined in Trend 7. And I'm going to go ahead and just talk about the data a little bit. Within that trend, we respondents were asked to categorize low, medium, high maturity. When we talked about low maturity, we defined that as initiatives are planned by an individual team or an ad hoc or as needed basis. Each initiative was a one-off. That was low maturity. Medium maturity was initiatives are planned at a departmental level with projects and data scientists and multiple teams. And IT is beginning to have projects with operational engineering time. That's medium maturity. And then high maturity was initiatives are planned annually with coordinated business functions for budgeting, staffing, and operational support. So just to recap, our maturity questions were really around how the initiative was treated from a planning, budgeting, support, consumption time. Diego, another question for you. There was a question here about what percentage of projects use subject matter experts alongside data scientists in developing machine learning models. It's not a question we asked in the survey, but I think you can speak from experience about that.
Yeah, so I think in in any analytical workload, whether it be in machine learning or business intelligence, like the subject matter experts are key, right? They're key to understand the relationships between the data. They're key to understand what the business metric means. They're key to understand what the output is. And so, again, from my experience, the closer that the data science and kind of like technical teams are to the business and understanding the business, the higher the result, the better the results are. So, and this is actually something that was like, again, this is predates any sort of like, enterprise machine learning. That's going back to even like business intelligence and analytics workloads. Like the key matter experts are always there, and because they need to be able to understand, hey, what does this data mean? What does this, just the statistical inference is not the only thing that matters. Like, what does the data mean? Why does it, what's the next action that we need to do that? So I actually think these hybrid teams with subject matter experts, data experts, data scientists, technical experts from an ML engineering and DevOps, like, product managers around applying AI and ML, this is the key to success. Like those cross-functional hybrid teams where you get that, these are the ones that have the high success rate of going from ideation to something that's actually moving the needle for a business.
Great, thank you. Hey, Diego, we actually have a product question about Algorithmia here. It's a quick one, I think. It's about how we are hosted. Do we host ML in our own data centers, or do enterprises buy deployment tools from Algorithmia and install them in the cloud so that the model can be co-hosted with where the data of that company is present? So
yeah, it's an easy answer. All of the above. So we run a SaaS service that you can actually go access at teams.algorithmia.com. And if you want to bring our infrastructure, our deployment, cataloging, serving, lifecycle management infrastructure into your organization, we can run that on-prem on your network or inside your VPCs in your cloud. So it's a dealer's choice. We give that flexibility of run it wherever you need it to run it. That could be where your data is. That could be where your security paradigms is. That could be where your applications are. So that's where we would run that platform.
That's great, thanks. Okay, let me answer one more technical question here. We had a question about when we talked about deployment times, whether or not data prep, data cleaning was included in the survey. And I just want to point out that we define time spent deploying models as the time spent prepping trained models and deploying them where they can be consumed by apps or used with other models. So we do believe that most response would likely have included data prep, though they likely wouldn't have included time spent collecting data if they didn't have that data already. Another question for you, Diego. How many of the respondents started a machine learning project with a process use case in mind from the outset, or was the outcome discovered after the fact? Again, not a question we asked, but one I think you probably know from experience.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I don't know the quantity of how many but I can tell you a stark difference between success and not. So the organizations that I've observed that start with a use case and say, hey, what we're trying to do is make automate this process because we can reduce our cost by X, or we can sell this for Y, and they started from what I call the end, which is okay. This is how we're going to move the needle. The next, the step before that is this is how it's going to work in production, right? So actually understanding what are the conditions of actually getting this to work, and then moving back on the okay, now that we understand of the conditions of how this would work in production, how do we train the data? Do we have the data? Do we have the resources? Can we work backwards? That mindset of kind of like starting from the business and moving backwards versus starting from a lab environment and saying, well, let's see what we can figure out, and not actually thinking about how we're actually going to go into production. So the success rate is much higher, what I would argue, from that right to left thought process, because you're kind of going into it with the end result in mind, right? So if you think about it, like you're actually going into any of these things, saying, how is this going to work in production? How are we actually going to run it? The path is already being defined as you go, versus investing a whole bunch on data and building a model and getting to a point of like, oh my God, yeah, we got this. We can actually use this. And then suddenly realizing that you have no idea how to actually get this into production inside your IT systems. So the success rate I've seen is quite split. Those that start from the end and work backwards have a much higher success rate than the ones that go the other way.
That's great. Hey, we're getting close to the end here. We did have a bunch of questions throughout about if people could get a recording or access to the slides, and I just wanted to let everyone know that all that will be available, through the Algorithmia website. You'll be able to download the report if you want to get the report in detail. We'll put a version of the slides and a recording of the webinar there. Our partners at AI4, of course, will follow up with everyone who registered, and they'll get links and communication to all that. So all that's coming. Diego, I had one question here that I know is going to be near and dear to your heart. And it's really a question from someone now who's experienced but training in data science, and really asking for, so this is you as a data science expert and as a CEO, like what you look for in someone's resume for data science. And maybe you can talk about, how we look at data science, what experiences are relevant, right? It's a growing industry. Obviously, we see from the report that there's huge demand for that skill set that's increased this year. And maybe just a little bit of insight on what you look for.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I think there's there's a core thing that you can't get away, which is kind of like, to be a data scientist, you have to have a certain level of statistical knowledge. Like nobody can get away from that. And so I'll put that on, like, that's kind of like a must have. You have to have that there. Now, I think there's two qualities in data scientists that are really, really important that, I would be looking at, which is one, their storytelling ability. So, it's about storytelling, and not in the sense of like inventing, but it's like, hey, how is this going to actually move the business? How can I actually grab this data? What is that data telling me? And how can we actually automate that? So there's an aspect of being able to communicate really, really well what the data means, because they have that statistical knowledge, being able to communicate out to the rest of the organization what this data is telling them, how they can actually do, the different things, and what that is. So there's a storytelling ability that is really, really important. And this is very similar to traditional BI analyst and BI expert, which is the storytelling ability is a really, really, really high factor in terms of being able to explain what they're seeing and communicating that precisely. The other aspect I look at is really ability to learn new things. So the space is moving so quickly, right? And so if you have the baseline kind of like technical knowledge, like what is your ability to learn new frameworks, learn new tools, learn new processes, really dive deep in terms of, again, going into the business, understanding what moves, the subject matter experts, having that communication, understand what moves the business, and being able to translate that into the best tooling to use, the best models to build, how to actually get there. Like, those are two factors that I would look at like really seriously, which are, again, beyond the like typical, like, hey, you need to be able to, if you're a data scientist, you need to be able to do Python, right? Like in R and stuff like that. Like that's kind of like table stakes. But if I look at kind of like extra ability, what I'm really be concentrating on is storytelling ability and ability to learn new things.
No, that's great. And it's interesting that question came up, because we just got one in here that again is, I think, near and dear to what the challenge is in the market. So the question was, can you please share the specific technical challenges that enterprises are facing with deploying and maintaining ML models? With containerization, Dockers and Kubernetes, shouldn't it be fairly straightforward to just deploy and upgrade the models? So can you talk a little bit about, obviously, the complexity there that we actually tackle?
Famous last words, right? Around that. So think about it, like, containerization is a great first step, and that allows for like repeatability and reproducibility. But, there's a bunch of factors that go into, and again, what we dive into, like, the main difference between traditional code. So we have these really built out DevOps practices around, around code and application, build, test, monitor, deploy. Like, these are all things that over the last 30 years of software development, we've gotten really good at automation. So if you think about like what a DevOps person really cares about is, security, speed, scalability. And, you go into that and you say, okay, well, what does ML mean in that? Like, how do we bring in machine learning into that? Well, now suddenly you're dealing with probabilistic code instead of deterministic code. And a whole bunch of things like pop up. And so just putting a model in a container doesn't solve security around all the dependencies, right? It doesn't solve how you monitor that model for decay. It doesn't solve, how you can actually understand, if the regulator comes in and says, hey, you have 3,000 models across your organization. Who's calling what, every single one of them? What are they doing? How do you do that? So like, you start getting like, the containerization of the model is a great first step, but that actually brings up a whole world of industrializing it and getting out of the one-offs. So, if you still are going and deploying a model as an individual container, and then actually going in and then deploying that container, and that's the recipe you're following, building a Flask app around it, how are you doing authentication? How are you doing backup recovery? How are you doing multi-region? How are you updating those containers in a way that's observable? If the person who actually built it the first time leaves the organization, where's the documentation? Like, so you have to start digging into a lot of these pieces that kind of come out of, that, like, with ease, there's sprawl. With sprawl, there's complexity. And so it's an awesome movement that we're seeing, but like some of these tools are actually generating good problems to have, but they're real problems, right? Which is, how do we deal with the sprawl, the repeatability, the global view of all my models in production, the risk to the organization. So I think these tools have made things way easier, but also accelerated the problems that come kind of on the other side of it.
That's great. Hey, Diego, we're at time. Thank you so much for taking all these questions. Thank you, everybody, for attending. A lot of heart and soul went into the report. We really believe in taking a point of view on what's happening in the industry, even outside the Algorithmia. And we make it available to everyone on the call. Look for a follow-up, and thanks, everyone. Patrika, any last housekeeping from you, or are we all done?
We're all set. I just wanted to say a very gracious thank you to Diego and to the entire Algorithmia team for sharing these incredible insights with us. We really appreciate you, and we're looking forward to getting our hands on that report. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. Have a great one, folks. Thanks for listening in.